Good day, everyone, and especially to our presenter and commentator, Professor Jeffrey Ding, and Yale World Fellow, George Chen. I'm Carol Lee Rafferty, a Yale College graduate and also Executive Director of Yale Center Beijing, Yale University's home here in China. For the past 10 years, since our founding in 2014, we've been hosting these types of activities where we convene thought leaders from all over the world to discuss the most cutting-edge issues facing humanity. Today, we're so delighted to be co-hosting this book talk together with the Princeton University Press Beijing office. This talk is part of the Princeton-Yale Ideas series, where we connect the Chinese audience and readers with authors on the most relevant topics. So, what drives the rise and fall of great powers? On this very important question, Professor Jeffrey Ding will discuss his new book with the Princeton University Press, Technology and the Rise of Great Powers: How Diffusion Shapes Economic Competition, together with Yale World Fellow George Chen. They will discuss the mechanisms of technological diffusion and how they are shaping the pattern of economic competition among great powers. Some of you may remember that George recently gave a talk at the Center on AI governance. So their insights are going to be especially topical to emerging technologies such as AI and their potential impact on the U.S. China power dynamic. Let me briefly introduce our presenter and commentator today. Jeffrey Ding is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University and serves as a reviewer for important academic journals such as the American Political Science Review. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. George Chen is a practitioner and scholar with over 2 decades of expertise across media, technology, and public policy. Currently, he's managing director and co-chair of digital practice for the policy consultancy, the Asia Group, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. He is also currently a senior fellow at the Center of Civil Society and Governance of the University of Hong Kong, where he teaches digital society and governance to master's students. Prior to these roles, he was Meta, or Facebook's first ever and most senior policy leader for Greater China, Mongolia, and Central Asia for almost a decade. And earlier in his career, George held various editorial and management roles at leading media organizations such as the South China Morning Post and Reuters. And actually, just when the center was founded in 2014, George was elected as a Yale World Fellow. So we're very, very honored and happy to have the two of them at this event today. The event will happen and proceed as follows. Professor Ding will first give a talk on his book, and then George will provide his comments. And then after that, the Q&A will begin. So before we dive in, I would like to extend a special thanks also to the Princeton University Press and Yale Center teams for making today's event and the event series possible. Professor Ding's book will be available for sale after the event. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Jeffrey Ding. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Carol. And thank you as well, George, for taking the time to join us today. I'm really looking forward to your comments and the questions from the audience. I think when we look at this hot topic of U.S. China competition in AI, this image is helpful. It's helpful for 2 reasons. The first is oftentimes this competition is seen as this geopolitical chessboard on which the different countries are trying to implement their own strategies. But the second reason it's helpful is anybody who plays chess or is following Ding Liren in the World Chess Championship knows that this position is not possible. The kings can't touch each other on a chessboard. And so I think this image is helpful because it shows that our understanding of what great power competition in emerging technologies looks like is very confused and muddled. Maybe one starting point we can use is Chinese leader Xi Jinping's speech to the BRICS summit in 2018. This summit of BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, all emerging economies that are making up an increasingly large portion of world population and GDP. At this BRICS summit, Chinese leader Xi talked about the fourth industrial revolution. And the whole summit was organized around the theme of the fourth industrial revolution. In the speech, some of the most important parts are he references these past three industrial revolutions and specifically calls out specific technologies in each of these industrial revolutions. What often happens in the Chinese system is leaders give speeches and then analysts and commentators will try to interpret those speeches a couple months later. So here's a publication from the Study Times, the 学习时报, Chinese, a relatively authoritative publication from the Chinese Communist Party, where 2 months later, they analyze this speech and they highlight that when countries take advantage of industrial revolutions, the main impact on the rise and fall of great powers comes through the country that achieves a world-leading productivity advantage. Who gains leadership in advanced productivity and becomes the most productive economy? Those of you familiar with international relations or history know this seminal work by historian Paul Kennedy, where he describes a similar process. The rise and fall of great powers is a process that involves, first, differentials in technological change leading to differentials in economic growth rates. And then that eventually shifts in political, geopolitical, and military leadership. And so today, and for the purposes of my book, I focus on the first step of that causal chain. How do these new technologies actually result in a shift in the global economic balances? Which great power is able to take advantage of these new technologies and sustain economic growth at higher rates than its rivals? Standard story that we hear a lot today is what I call the leading sector theory. Okay. Yeah, 领先行业 could work. Another way to translate that would be 领洋头产业, right? So leading sector theory, under leading sector theory, one country dominates technological advances in new fast-growing industries. They get to control all the monopoly profits from being the innovation leader, and then they reinvest those, take the gains that they get from exports, reinvest those into their economy, and achieve world-leading productivity. Daniel Dresner, a scholar from Tufts University, summarizes it well. A great power becomes a hegemon through a near monopoly on innovation in leading sectors. And this might sound pretty familiar to you. We all live and work in Beijing or Washington, D.C., and in policymaking circles are very much influenced by this perspective. What are leading sectors? Development economist Walt Rostow gives this classic sequence of great leading sectors that includes cotton textile industry in the first industrial revolution, the steel and chemical industries in the second industrial revolution, automobile industry in U.S. Japan competition in the third industrial revolution. They oftentimes are very fast-growing single sectors that sometimes become one of the largest industries in an economy. Today, I'm going to argue that there's a different explanation for how technological revolutions lead to the rise and fall of great powers. And I want to focus on general purpose technologies, 通用技术. And my argument here is that general purpose technologies, or GPTs, are going to shape economic competition between great powers in a pathway that's very different from what I just started this talk with as it relates to leading sectors. And once we have a different sense of the technology trajectory, that's going to shape what institutional factors that different countries are going to have to adapt to be successful in technological revolutions. My book focuses on the education and training systems that widen the base of engineering skills associated with the general purpose technology. So that was the 2-minute overview of the argument. Next, I'm going to fill out the theory in more detail. Then I'm going to present some evidence, primarily from the second industrial revolution. And then finally, we'll return back to the beginning and answer this question of what are the US and China actually competing for in AI? The basis for this argument is new technologies present demands for countries. And so whichever country is going to be most successful in adapting to a new technology has to develop the institutions to meet those demands. And those institutions can range from a country's political system, the level of centralization or decentralization in terms of how it approaches science and technology policy. It could be the system by which countries organize their businesses. Do they support big business alliances like Japan's Keiretsu system? Or do they support a more competitive industrial landscape? My book focuses on the institutions of skill formation, talent cultivation. The existing literature, that leading sector theory, they want to focus on the demands of new technologies from the perspective of innovation, 创新. Technological change can be mapped out into 3 different phases. Invention is the first time a new discovery comes out in the world. Innovation is the first time that a company pioneers and commercializes that new invention. Diffusion, 技术扩散, is that phase by which a new technology spreads across a population of users. So leading sector is all about that invention and innovation stage, that eureka moment. And so they focus on a country's ability to adapt its institutional factors for monopolizing innovation in leading sectors. So they care a lot about how much is your country spending on cutting edge R&D? Does your country have the systems to prevent these cutting edge innovations from leaking out to other countries? This is based on something called the leading sector product cycle, or the leading sector theory is based on something called the product cycle theory. And essentially, this treats the nation like a firm that has a new product innovation. So your country comes out with a new smartphone innovation. They invested all this R&D. They came out with this fancy, shiny new product. And so there's a window of time where you are the only player and you get to control monopoly profits. But shortly after, other competitors, other countries going to develop their own smartphones. And once that competition increases, your profits decline, and you lose that window where you had monopoly profits. So these are just a few quotes from international relations and political science scholars that are using that product cycle as a template. I think the last quote is what I want to emphasize to you here, which is the leading sector account says the country that is the pioneer in all these new innovations, they get the benefits of monopoly profits until the diffusion stage, right? That's where their story ends. They don't care about the diffusion stage because that's when they think the advantages to the leader go away. For my alternative theory, that's where my story starts, the diffusion stage. And so GPT diffusion theory focuses on general purpose technologies, not leading sectors. I think what I want to emphasize here is that we really need to understand the characteristics of GPTs and how they are different from leading sectors. sometimes when I read articles or blogs on emerging technology policy, it feels like everything sounds the same regardless of what technology they're talking about. If you saw a paper on quantum computing, you could just find and replace quantum with blockchain or AI. It's all just boilerplate copied and pasted. We need to take seriously the differences between technologies. So let me just give a simple example. Everybody is really interested in China's advances in electric vehicles. EVs are a leading sector, not a GPT. Let's compare EVs to something like AI, which I think has that potential to be a GPT. EVs have one single use case: transportation, getting from point A to B. AI has countless, I couldn't even list all the different use cases of AI in terms of how it is affecting the ability to write, the ability to code, the ability to generate images, the ability to perceive landscapes in terms of applications in autonomous vehicles. One way to really test this is think about, are advances in electric vehicles fundamentally transforming what's happening in the AI industry? No. But think about the other direction. Are advances in AI fundamentally transforming what's happening in the electric vehicle industry? Answer is a resounding yes. One technology is more enabling than the other. One technology is more general purpose than the other. So if we care about GPTs, the key point here, this is Stanford historian Paul David, he says that GPTs make their mark on the economy through a regular pattern. And this pattern is an extended trajectory of incremental technical improvements over time, which results in a gradual and protracted process of diffusion into widespread use across the entire economy. Now, if we care about GPTs, then that diffusion stage really matters, because the potential population of users or adopters of a GPT is essentially the entire economy. And so, of course, maybe if your country is the first to pioneer new technologies, that might help you with widespread adoption, but it's not the only factor. And actually, when you think about competition between the most advanced economies, for a field as broad as AI or electricity or the computer, they're all going to have frontier firms and universities who are close to the technological frontier in a GPT, right? Think about the U.S. and China today when it comes to AI. No one country is monopolizing innovation in this space. China's top universities, the Tsinghuas of the world, China's top firms, the Zhipu AIs of the world, the Baidus of the world, are very close to that technological frontier. And so it might be the divergences, the differences in long-term economic growth might be more about which country can take those innovations from their frontier firms and spread them throughout the entire economy. Okay, last part of the argument. I've shown you how GPTs make their economic impact in a way that's different from leading sectors. Now, that means there needs to be different institutions that meet the demands of GPT diffusion. And so I highlight the institutions that widen the pool of engineering talent linked to GPTs. That's going to address a couple of problems. That's necessary to address a couple of problems. One is pretty obvious. Technology always races ahead and skills have to keep up. But I think number two is especially important. For a GPT to spread, you need to have coordination and information flows between the GPT sector and all the different application sectors that could use the GPT. You don't need that for leading sectors. For electric vehicles, you don't need the electric vehicle industry to coordinate with the construction industry or the education industry for electric vehicles to make an economic impact. But for AI, the construction industry needs to know what's happening in the AI industry for AI to spread across sectors. The education industry needs to know, okay, what are the latest large language models? How do I benchmark whether this LLM is more efficient or more effective than another LLM? Where is the AI sector going? Because then in order for me to develop complementary innovations, I need to know what's happening in the GPT sector. And so engineering knowledge helps systematize and standardize the best practices in a GPT and facilitates those information flows between a GPT sector and all the different application sectors with their own unique demands. That's why historically, when we see the emergence of a new GPT, we often see a completely new engineering discipline follow. So think electricity and electrical engineering, or the computer and computer science. It doesn't have the word engineering in it, but computer science is very much an engineering-oriented discipline. Okay, to sum up, what we're trying to do here is asking a very simple question. How do technological revolutions affect and shape an economic power transition? One great power sustains economic growth at higher rates than its rivals over the long run because of a productivity advantage. I've given you the conventional wisdom, leading sector, and then I've given you my alternative theory, GPT diffusion. Now I'm mapping out that the technological trajectories differ on 3 dimensions. When do the technological changes make their greatest impact? Does it come very early in that brief window of monopoly profits? Or does it come in a very delayed and protracted process, like it is for GPTs? Second dimension, what is the phase of technological change that is the most important for deciding which country gets ahead or not? Is it about innovation, monopolizing innovation, or is it about having that edge in diffusion, spreading that GPT across the most users within your country? Third, is technological change and economic growth concentrated in just a few leading sectors, or is it dispersed and broad-based like we would expect with the GPT? Now, lastly, that's going to affect the institutional adaptations that countries have to make. If you care more about leading sectors, you might care more about deepening the skill base, training the best and the brightest in these new industries. If you care more about GPTs, you emphasize what I call GPT skill infrastructure and widening the engineering skill base in these technologies. Okay. Enough theory. Let's move into actual evidence. We're going to rewind to the second industrial revolution. Note how the book covers the same 3 industrial revolutions that the speech by Chinese leader Xi Jinping gave at the BRICS summit. And so second industrial revolution, 1870 to 1914. Here we have all these different innovations. Scholars see it as one of the densest periods of scientific advance. And crucially, we see a shift in the economic balance of power. This is the decline of Great Britain and the rise of Germany and the US. What I want to emphasize here is that when you look at the data on economic efficiency and economic productivity, the US becomes the preeminent economic power before 1914. US is the blue line, Britain is the green, Germany is the red. Germany never surpasses the UK in terms of economic productivity. So what we're doing in this exercise is we are trying to ask, how did the US benefit from the technological advances in the second industrial revolution to become the preeminent economic power before World War I? Did it follow the GPT diffusion path, or did it follow the leading sector theory? And I'm just going to go through all of those dimensions on this table step by step. So let's start with impact time frame. I think all of the evidence in this era suggests, at least for the US, we don't see the near immediate impact of some of these new technologies, like chemicals. Electrification does not have a significant impact on US economic productivity until after 1914. So we get the advent of the electric dynamo in 1870, but it takes all of those decades for electricity to diffuse throughout the US economy. Rather, the key technology in this era, in my view, is this general purpose technology of interchangeable parts manufacture. Essentially, we had these earlier innovations in the 1840s, 1850s with machine tools like the turret lathe and the universal milling machine. This is Jichuang. And so these machine tools allow you to shape and cut metal and wood in more precise ways so that you can have standardized parts. So when a bicycle breaks down, you don't have to get a whole new bicycle. You can just replace that part because you can cut the material in more precise and standardized ways. And so these practices, these interchangeable parts manufacturing processes, are general purpose in that they can be used to make not just bicycles, not just sewing machines, but also other machine tools and firearms, and they affect all these different manufacturing industries. And so by the time the US is completing its economic rise, that's when these machine tools are spreading throughout American industry. Second question, is the US's advantage based on innovation leadership or diffusion leadership? Actually, the US is not the definitive leader in innovation in leading sectors. When it came to electricity, for example, the British Institute of Electrical Engineers assesses that when it comes to inventive genius, the UK is not that far behind. But when it comes to practical application, that's where the UK has fallen behind the US. In terms of interchangeable parts manufacturing, a few indicators show that the US is outpacing Britain and Germany by more than double the rate by this time period. And so Great Britain sends all these study teams to the US to try to figure out what's happening here. Why are we falling so far behind? They report back that it's about this eagerness of diffusion in the United States, spreading machinery across all different industries. Third, the breadth of economic growth and technological change. It's not concentrated in just a few industries. The US has broad-based productivity growth in this period. Lastly, what accounts for the US's advantage? What accounts for the US's success in the second industrial revolution? If my theory is right, we should expect that the US is able to widen the base of engineering talent. It has the institutions that are better equipped to widen the base of mechanical engineering talent for spreading this interchangeable parts manufacturing method. And that is the case. Britain did not produce enough mechanical engineers. And Germany did produce enough, but that mechanical engineering education was not connected to industrial and commercial applications. It wasn't standardized and systematized in that way. So here's one piece of evidence on that. This is from the US Bureau of Education report from around that time period, and they're translating a German engineering professor's assessment. And the top 3 rows are mechanical engineering schools representative of the German model. The bottom 2 rows are engineering schools representative of the US model at that time. The dark shaded lines, the black lines, are the amount of time in the curriculum dedicated to practical exercises in the lab and shop. The gray lines are dedicated to oral and theoretical instruction. So you see how the US has a significant advantage in terms of the time devoted to mechanical engineering education that is based in practical exercises in the lab and shop. I'm going to skip the stuff on chemicals. Okay. That's a lot of words on that slide. I'm not going to go through all of them. What I want to show in these other historical cases that are each their own chapter in the book, I just want to show you that I'm doing the same exercise for all of them, going through these 4 dimensions that we just went through with the second industrial revolution case. Third industrial revolution, US-Japan competition in the 1980s, 1990s. What's interesting here is that everyone expects that Japan will become the #1 technological power, but it doesn't come to be. The leading sector mechanism can't really explain this because Japan dominates in all these new industries like consumer electronics, semiconductor components. My theory can explain it. Japan does not lead the US when it comes to the adoption of general purpose technologies, most notably the computer. Okay. Now let's circle back all the way to the beginning. What does this mean for US-China competition in AI? I'm going to do the same exercise where I look at the shape of the technological trajectory across 3 dimensions, and then examine which country will be best prepared to adapt to the demands of AI. And when most people discuss US-China AI competition, they're largely relying on the leading sector model. My argument here is that on all these dimensions, if you take my GPT diffusion model as a basis, you're going to have very, very different conclusions. So let's start. #1, impact timeframe. This is in the leading sector model. This is the National Security Commission on AI's final report, a very influential body set up in the US. I'm also citing Graham Allison, Harvard professor, Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, Li Kai-fu. I think most people here know him. He wrote this book on AI superpowers. They're very much rooted in the leading sector model, and their time frame for when AI could lead China to surpass the US in technological leadership, their time frame is very early. It matches this expectation that leading sectors will have disproportionate impacts early after the sector's development, right? All within this decade. For me, if you take GPT diffusion theory seriously, and we know from past GPTs, they take multiple decades to diffuse and make their mark throughout the entire economy, then let's set 2012 as the date when this new deep learning paradigm was incubated with the AlexNet submission to Stanford's ImageNet competition. If it's going to take multiple decades to diffuse, and remember, electricity took more than 4 decades to diffuse, then we shouldn't see major productivity payoffs from AI until after 2030. Okay, next. Is it going to be about innovation leadership or diffusion leadership? So a lot of the analysis about whether China can catch up or overtake the US in AI focuses on China's innovation capacity. What is China doing when it comes to investments in cutting-edge AI research and development? What are the most valuable big firms and startups? For me, I have an alternative perspective because I care more about, is China competitive with the US when it comes to the diffusion of AI? And some preliminary evidence comes from China actually ranks pretty middling when it comes to the diffusion of other information and communications technologies. I'm citing some indexes collected by the International Telecommunications Union. China also lags the US significantly in terms of the diffusion of key digital technologies like cloud computing, smart sensors, and industrial software. I'll point you to one of my other articles where I argue that China faces a diffusion deficit. On the left, you have all these different indicators of innovation capacity. How much is your country spending on R&D? What's the average R&D spending of your top 3 firms, your Huawei's, your Alibaba's? What's the average global ranking of your top 3 research universities? On all those metrics, China ranks very, very high. Average ranking of 11. When it comes to diffusion capacity, how intensive have information communications technologies permeated across businesses and small size and medium sized businesses? How well do the different parts of your science and technology ecosystem talk to each other? Is there strong linkages and connective tissue between your universities and your industry? China's average ranking is more middling. Third point, is your technology policy directed at just a few leading sectors? Or are you recognizing that technological change and economic growth under the GPT model is dispersed throughout all these different industries? Here's actually a think tank affiliated with the State Council, Guoyuan here, where it's saying, hey, maybe China should reconsider picking winners in terms of developing a few new technologies and move towards more of this horizontal economy-wide effort. Last point, who's better positioned to compete in the age of AI? The question here is, which country has the institutions that are equipped to widen the base of engineering skills in AI? Again, I think there's a preliminary case for a US advantage. One indicator from the book in the last chapter is I try to count up the number of universities in both countries that meet a very low quality baseline for training average AI engineers. So all you have to do is have, your university has to have at least one faculty, just one, that has published in an established AI conference. China, by that metric, has 29 universities. The US has 159. So once you get past the Beidas, the Tsinghuas, the Nanjings, Nanjing universities of the world, by comparison, the US has a broader bench of institutions that can train average AI engineers. When it comes to industry academic linkages, remember, diffusion is all about getting different parts of the science and technology ecosystem to talk to each other and have common standards and protocols. One indicator of that is which country has more hybrid AI publications. So your AI publications that have at least one co-author from industry and one co-author from academia. US leads the world in that metric, according to Stanford HAI's AI index. China faces significant challenges in this space. I'll leave you with some of my policy recommendations, which are mostly focused at the US government. This is a foreign affairs op-ed that I published based on the book that says, currently the US's approach to competing with China is very much based in the leading sector model. We think that we can monopolize innovations in AI and prevent these cutting edge technologies from leaking out. This is the Fortress America approach. I'm saying instead, if we adopt a diffusion-centric model, it shouldn't be about Fortress America. It should be about running faster than competitors and prioritizing how to improve and sustain the rate at which AI becomes adopted in a wide range of productive processes. And in this op-ed, I lay out a few specific proposals, such as providing more support for community colleges to widen different pathways to training average AI engineers. Let me leave it there. The holidays are coming up, so if you want a good gift for a friend or yourself, please consider getting a copy and helping to diffuse the ideas in this book. Thanks for your attention, and looking forward to George's comments and the questions to follow.
Can you hear me? All good?
Yes, we can hear you, George.
That's quite a lot. Actually, um, um, I'm impressed. How you can sort of pack the four industrial revolutions into 30 minutes 40 minutes talk. Helping us to go through the history, the ups and downs, and everything. I'll just quickly, give a key takeaways. As yeah, you were doing the presentation, I took some notes. I think the importance of the book is, it came at a very interesting time. As you introduced it at the very beginning. Everybody talking about the U.S. China competition, and people know how important technology is. But I think that this is, very timely for, not just politicians and policymakers, and also for the students and scholars to look into, how the U.S. China tensions started to emerge and get worse, and how that is related to the competition for technology. So I think that in that aspect, the book gives a very fresh perspective to understand the politics around the two big powers. We perhaps talked too much about the trade war. I think it's obvious, as Biden took over the White House, the trade war quickly shifted to more like a technology war, and then all kind of like a mixture of trade war plus tech war. Even if you look at the trade war nowadays, people talking about the export bans, chips and AI. This is still very much related to technology. So that's point one. Secondly, I think you build your research also based on some previous scholars research. Paul Kennedy is a great scholar. I think he was the first to sort of look into how great a country could be, and how a country could fall in terms of its contribution to the world economy. Before Paul Kennedy, people talk more about like gun power, right? As Chairman Mao said, you have guns, you have the regime. People talk about how many nuclear missiles you have. I think Paul very much looking to the economic power perspective. By the way, I think he's still teaching at the Yale University. Just free advertisement for Yale. He's getting older, but I think he's still doing some lectures. The other finding, and it's just to me, even I worked in the tech industry for a long time, which was quite inspiring, is you talking about the difference between of course people understand the invention and innovation, but I think the third dimension is actually more interesting. The diffusion. I think I really like the example you used. Why Chinese EVs are so popular, right? And then you are in Beijing. Our audience in Beijing. If you go out and then look at how many cars in the Beijing streets, you will be very impressed. So how quickly a technology can be applied for general use, that also affects a lot. And in comparison, I think the US is still hugely left behind in terms of the EVs for the public, like for ordinary people to get on it. It's getting there, but the concentration, the penetration ratio is still far lower, even than those Nordic countries. So that's very interesting. I think perhaps we should hear more from you. If we look from diffusion perspective, why some countries sort of have the first mover advantage, like Japan, right? But how in the end that they didn't really became the champion, while other countries, and I think now China has sort of the potential. Maybe in some ways, China was still behind the US, in terms of AI developments. But in terms of how fast the AI adoption could be, for the society and business, China could take a very good lead against the U.S. in the next 5 to 10 years. I think this is also why the U.S. is a bit worried. And I also read some literature recently. People say the AI adoption in Japan, for example, is pretty low, like around the 10%. While in China, the AI adoption in business is already like around the 40%. It's arguable, Japan also has great, AI scientists and researchers, but how come like Japan is a little bit slow, when it comes to AI adoption? for business and society. And that's also a very interesting, question. Especially when we think of from the diffusion perspective. I think related to that, your argument about the leading sector model, the so-called the 领头羊优势, right? Whether a country should just focus on several sectors, and China has also those national champions like BAT and Huawei, right? That's one aspect. The other aspect is still the adoption. So I think this is also an interesting our argument. The car industry in the U.S. is actually a quite sad story. I will argue, they used to have, very good, advantage, the first mover advantage, the leading sector advantage. But how come, it just, completely, left behind in the whole, competitions, when EV emerged as a new technology, right? So that's also an interesting angle. So I have a couple of questions, but I don't want to occupy the whole time. I'm pretty sure the audience will also have a lot of sorts of questions to share. So maybe I start with one question. I don't know if it's perhaps less relevant to the book, but I was also I always a bit puzzled. So you didn't have time to touch on sort of the way how internet and the cyberspace is regulated and governed, right, in different countries. I think that also matters in terms of innovation. But one question people always ask is, okay, so when if the conventional wisdom will say, okay, so innovation will happen when you have a more free environment, right, for research, academic research and scientific research and this and that. But how can we argue, like everybody knows, like China's internet is very, very restrictive, perhaps the most restrictive among the major powers in the world. But how can we argue, like even given, such high censorship and tight control of the internet, and in a way, that also affect innovation, but we still have quite a successful internet companies, naming the BAT, right? Does that mean Silicon Valley, yes, they have the free environment, but the freedom in governance, is not necessarily a key element, to push for more innovation. I'll just leave the question there. So maybe you can have some thoughts. And then the second question is more about the U.S. China competition. So crystal ball, but you focus very much on the argument about the diffusion. So I don't know if the U.S. government can get it. If the current tension continues to rise, it's going to be lose-lose, for both U.S. and China, in terms of basically we talk about how to make the cake bigger, right? Rather than like everyone just try to grab one slice. I don't have a good answer to that, but I'm also curious to hear your thought. Is there a solution for both sides to see, this is not a zero-sum game currently we are in the fourth industrial revolution, right? Or is this just the fate of the world? Because if you look back into the history, every industrial revolution so far can only have one strong lead, like to survive, rather than two countries can share the power in some key innovation technology. This might be also a deep concern inside the many American politicians' mind. There's no like a number two. The world only recognizes number one when it comes to key technologies. So I'll just leave the two questions there. I'm pretty sure the audience will have their own questions too. Thanks a lot. Great book, great presentation. I think this is very timely a bit because the whole world is so crazy. Like people are just confused. I think when we're confused, it's always useful to look into history to draw some lessons, from what happened and to see, what could happen next. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, George. Really appreciate you taking the time to dig into this and give your own thoughts based on your experience. And your unique vantage point and also raising some really thought-provoking questions. Let me go through some of your comments and then we'll get into the broader Q&A. So first, before I address the two questions, I think it's important to go in depth on this EV example. EVs are not a general purpose technology. So yes, China might be ahead in terms of EV adoption, but I don't see that as being connected to widespread productivity growth as much as the potential of AI. So I do think China has shown that it can be a strong diffusion leader in two types of settings. One is when it's about scaling up infrastructure, which can be done with a top-down coordinated approach from the government. So example there is high-speed rail. Two is, and maybe EVs fall under this category, when adoption by consumers is relatively cheap and doesn't have too many barriers to entry. And so think mobile payment systems or food delivery systems. Diffusion of GPTs is much more difficult because you need businesses to adopt it and embed it into productive processes to improve productivity. It can't be coordinated from the top down. See example A of the Soviet Union. And it's much more difficult to do than just consumer-facing adoption. With EVs, the consumer doesn't need, the user doesn't need to have an engineer to help them implement the technology. For AI, if you're a small-sized, medium-sized firm in Hunan province, you're going to need at least one AI engineer in your firm to be able to implement AI. And you have to make the profit case. There has to be sort of a fast-acting natural diffusion mechanism. So that's one thing I think we need to get to that level of detail rather than just China scales up everything means it's going to diffuse faster. Okay, on your two really important questions. First is, what is the role of governance and regulation? And how do we think about concerns that China's need to control and regulate information flows and censor information means that it won't be able to innovate in this space? I think you drew a really good example that we've seen in the internet space that China can still be very, very innovative despite strict censorship controls. And we're starting to see that with AI as well. I was just talking to someone who has talked with Alibaba and how they're controlling their large language models. And essentially, it's just daily calls with the censorship authorities using the same practices that they do for other censorship, such as on like Taobao forums. And so China seems to have developed a way to still innovate in the context of these censorship demands. Let me give one example that touches on all the points you raised on that first thread, because I think it unpacks the complicated picture. So let's go back to April 2023. China, with the Cyberspace Administration, CAC, releases the draft new generative AI regulations. And this draft imposes some really, really strict regulations and requirements on generative AI service providers that have public opinion properties or social mobilization capacity. One of the requirements at the time in that draft in April was generative AI service providers need to verify the objectivity and accuracy of their training data. Now, these LLMs are essentially training on all of the available Chinese language text on the internet, or essentially like the equivalent of Wikipedia. It would be like trying to verify the accuracy and the objectivity of the Wikipedia corpus or the Baidu Baike corpus. Over the course of that summer, then we have the revised version that comes out in August and relaxes a lot of those overly stringent restrictions. And so you start to see the push and pull between how much can we control these models to prevent sensitive political outputs, and how much do we need to balance that with ensuring we can still compete in this space? As for your second question, in terms of where do I see this space going, and what is the potential for getting away from zero-sum competition? So I think what I would say to that is, if both countries adopt a GPT diffusion focused approach, then it's not necessarily about controlling the other side from being able to run the race at all. It's about, let's see who runs faster based off of our institutions. I'm not going to try to control you and prevent you from running the race at all, because doing that would actually hurt my ability to run. So let me give a specific example for that. In the US right now, there's a debate over whether the US should try to expand the export control regime to AI open source models, open source AI models. So like, think the Meta Llama series, or the best Chinese open source large language model is Alibaba's Q1, or DeepSeek's version. And so I think if the US were to do that, that's an example where you become more closed, and when you try to, when you hurt your own open source ecosystem, that's going to hinder the US's diffusion capacity in AI, right? So efforts to become more closed might actually trade off with your own country's ability to run faster. And so there, it's not like this magical world of win-win where everything's in harmony, but maybe there is a world where the US and China are just trying to compete on even terms to see who can run faster on GPT diffusion. Let me leave it there, and George, feel free to chime in when we get to the Q&A session as well, but let's open it up to the folks in the room, and really looking forward to seeing what you all have to say.